Welcome to our Christian channel, Whispers of Bible. If you are a true Christian, or if you are looking to grow deeper in your faith, this is the place for you. We invite you to subscribe, like, and share this channel with your family, friends, and fellow Christians. Let them be a part of this journey with us as we dive into the wisdom of the Bible, share God's love, and walk together in faith. Share this channel with your loved ones and encourage them to join us in this spiritual journey. Let's build a community of believers, supporting each other as we grow closer to God. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and share the message with those who are ready to experience the whispers of God.
The story of Ruth unfolds quietly within the pages of Scripture, yet its significance reaches far beyond its modest length. It is a narrative shaped, not by kings or prophets, but by widows, fields, and daily choices made under the weight of loss. The Book of Ruth stands as a testament to how God's faithfulness is often revealed not through dramatic miracle, but through steadfast loyalty, ordinary obedience, and unseen providence working patiently over time. Ruth's story is set during one of the most turbulent and morally unstable periods in Israel's history, the time of the Judges. Scripture describes this era with a haunting refrain: everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Political unity was fragile, spiritual faithfulness inconsistent, and cycles of rebellion and deliverance marked the nation's life. Violence, famine, and idolatry were not distant threats, they were lived realities. Against this backdrop of instability, the Book of Ruth offers something unexpected: a gentle, intimate story focused on kindness, commitment, and hope. The narrative begins not with abundance, but with scarcity. A famine strikes the land of Bethlehem, a town whose name ironically means house of bread. This detail alone sets the tone for the story. Bethlehem, a place associated with provision and blessing, becomes a place of hunger. The famine is not explained, nor is it explicitly linked to judgment. Scripture leaves the cause unstated, inviting readers to focus not on blame, but on response. In this moment of hardship, a man named Elimelech leaves Bethlehem with his wife Naomi and their two sons, Mahalon and Chilion, and travels east to the land of Moab. This decision carries both practical and theological weight. Moab, while geographically close, represents more than foreign soil. Historically, Moab has a complicated relationship with Israel, marked by hostility and spiritual tension. Moabite religion and customs stand outside Israel's covenant identity. Yet famine pushes Elimelech's family beyond familiar boundaries in search of survival. This migration reflects a recurring biblical tension between faith and necessity. Scripture does not explicitly condemn Elimelech's decision, but neither does it romanticize it. The move to Moab is portrayed as pragmatic rather than ideal. It reveals how vulnerable families respond when stability collapses, and how faith is often tested not in moments of clarity, but in seasons of desperation. Tragedy follows quickly. Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Her two sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, forming bonds that cross cultural and religious lines. For a brief moment, life continues, but then loss compounds. Both sons die, leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth widowed and without protection, inheritance, or clear future. In the ancient Near Eastern world, widowhood carried profound vulnerability. Without a husband or sons, a woman's economic security and social standing were severely diminished. Naomi's losses are not only personal, they are existential. She is far from home, disconnected from her people, and facing a future marked by uncertainty. The narrative emphasizes the fullness of her emptiness, not as a dramatic flourish, but as a sober reality. It is within this space of loss that the story of Ruth truly begins. Before Ruth speaks or acts, Scripture establishes the depth of the situation. This is not a story of instant redemption, but of gradual restoration. God's faithfulness will emerge slowly, woven through human decisions rather than imposed through divine spectacle. The turning point comes when Naomi hears that the Lord has visited his people in Bethlehem and given them food. This brief statement is significant. God's action is mentioned quietly, without fanfare. There is no prophet announcing it, no miracle described, only provision restored. Naomi decides to return home, not because her circumstances have improved, but because hope has re-entered the land she once left. As Naomi prepares to leave Moab, she urges her daughters-in-law to return to their own families. Her reasoning is compassionate and realistic. She has nothing to offer them, no sons, no security, no future. Naomi's words reflect a worldview shaped by grief and limitation. She believes her story has ended, and she does not want to bind others to her perceived hopelessness. This moment introduces one of the most profound themes of the book, choice in the face of loss. Orpah and Ruth are given the same option. Both have cared for Naomi, both have suffered loss. Yet their responses will diverge, shaping the narrative's direction. Orpah's decision to return to her people is not condemned. It is understandable and culturally appropriate. Ruth's choice, however, transcends expectation. Before examining Ruth's loyalty in detail, it is important to recognize the historical weight of her identity. Ruth is a Moabite woman. According to Israelite law and tradition, Moabites occupied a marginal, often negative status. They were outsiders shaped by a different history and faith. Ruth's inclusion in Israel's story will later challenge assumptions about belonging, purity, and God's redemptive scope. But at this point in the narrative, Ruth is simply a widow standing at a crossroads. The Book of Ruth does not rush this moment. It allows the tension to breathe. Naomi insists again that Ruth should return. She speaks of the Lord's hand being against her, revealing a theology shaped by sorrow. Naomi believes God has dealt bitterly with her, yet even here, Scripture does not correct her. It allows lament to stand alongside faith, honoring the honesty of grief. Ruth's response, when it comes, is not framed as a theological argument, but as a vow of loyalty. Her words, spoken to Naomi, express a commitment that goes beyond social obligation. Ruth chooses to bind her future to Naomi's fate, her people, and her God. This decision is extraordinary not because it is dramatic, but because it is costly. Ruth willingly embraces uncertainty, poverty, and outsider status for the sake of relationship. This act of loyalty sets the foundation for everything that follows. Ruth's story is not driven by ambition or reward, but by devotion. Her faithfulness is not loud or self-conscious. It is practical, embodied, and sustained over time. In choosing Naomi, Ruth steps into a story larger than she can possibly see. Historically, the Book of Ruth serves as a bridge between eras. It looks back to the chaos of the judges and forward to the emergence of Israel's monarchy. Yet it does so indirectly through family lines rather than political events. This subtlety is intentional. The narrative suggests that God's redemptive work often advances not through national upheaval but through faithfulness in ordinary lives. The book's placement in Scripture reinforces this message. Ruth appears as a small, intimate text amid larger historical narratives, reminding readers that God's purposes are not always revealed through power or spectacle. Sometimes they are revealed through harvest fields, shared meals, and quiet perseverance. As Part 1 concludes, the stage is set. A famine has displaced a family. Loss has stripped Naomi of hope. Ruth stands as a foreign widow, choosing loyalty over safety. God's name has been spoken only sparingly, yet his presence already lingers beneath the surface. This is the beginning of a story about faithfulness that outlasts despair, loyalty that defies expectation, and a God who works patiently through human love. The life of Ruth will not unfold as a sudden reversal, but as a steady revelation of how God's faithfulness meets human devotion step by step, choice by choice, in the midst of ordinary days. To fully appreciate the depth of Ruth's story, we must step more carefully into the world she inhabited, a world shaped by fragile survival, strict social structures, and deeply embedded ideas about belonging, inheritance, and faith. Ruth does not emerge from a vacuum. Her choices, loyalty, and courage gain their meaning from the cultural and historical realities that surrounded her. Understanding these realities allows us to see just how radical her faithfulness truly was. The Book of Ruth unfolds during the era of the Judges, a period marked by instability and spiritual fragmentation. Israel existed as a loose confederation of tribes rather than a unified nation. There was no king, no centralized authority, and no consistent enforcement of justice. Survival often depended on family networks, land inheritance, and local customs. In this context, loyalty to one's kin was not merely emotional, it was essential for survival. For women, especially widows, life was precarious. Social and economic security flowed almost entirely through male relatives, fathers, husbands, or sons. Without them, a woman faced the possibility of poverty, exploitation, or social invisibility. The law of Israel provided some protections for widows and the poor, but these protections depended on communal faithfulness, which was uneven during the time of the Judges. Naomi's story must be understood within this reality. As an Israelite woman, her identity and security were bound to her family and land. Leaving Bethlehem during the famine was not simply a geographical relocation. It was a departure from ancestral inheritance and covenantal identity. The land was not just property, it was a tangible expression of God's promise to Israel. To leave it carried emotional and spiritual weight. Moab, the land to which Naomi's family fled, lay east of the Jordan River. The Moabites traced their ancestry to a complicated and morally charged origin story recorded in Israel's scriptures. Over generations, hostility and suspicion had grown between Moab and Israel. Moabite religious practices centered on gods foreign to Israel's covenant faith, and intermarriage was often viewed with anxiety or outright condemnation. For Naomi's sons to marry Moabite women was therefore significant. These marriages placed Ruth and Orpah at the margins of Israel's story long before Ruth ever spoke her famous vow. Ruth was not merely a foreigner, she belonged to a people Israel often regarded with distrust. Her eventual integration into Israel's life would challenge deeply ingrained assumptions about purity, worth, and God's redemptive reach. Ruth's early life in Moab is largely unrecorded, and this silence is intentional. Scripture does not define her by lineage, upbringing, or religious education. Instead, Ruth is revealed through action rather than background. This narrative choice allows her character to emerge through loyalty rather than pedigree. In a world obsessed with ancestry, Ruth's worth will be revealed through faithfulness. Naomi's identity, by contrast, is firmly rooted in Israel. Her name means pleasant, a reflection of hope and fullness. Yet by the time the story begins in earnest, that name feels painfully ironic. Loss has reshaped her understanding of God and herself. Her bitterness is not presented as rebellion, but as honest lament. This honesty reflects a cultural tradition within Israel that allowed grief to be voiced directly to God. The relationship between Naomi and her daughters-in-law develops within shared suffering. Ruth and Orpah are not passive figures attached to Naomi's story. They are fellow widows who have experienced loss alongside her. Their grief binds them together. In this shared vulnerability, familial boundaries blur. Love grows not from obligation, but from companionship forged through hardship. When Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem, she urges Ruth and Orpah to remain in Moab. Her reasoning reflects the cultural realities of the time. In Moab, the women might remarry within their own people, regain social standing, and find stability. In Israel, Ruth and Orpah would be foreigners, dependent on charity and vulnerable to exclusion. Naomi's insistence that they return is not selfish, it is protective. This moment reveals much about Naomi's worldview. She believes her story has been emptied of blessing. She interprets her losses as evidence of divine opposition. Yet even in this belief, Naomi does not turn away from God. She speaks of him openly, honestly, and with familiarity. Her faith has been wounded, not abandoned. This nuanced portrayal of grief reflects a mature biblical understanding of suffering, one that allows space for protest without severing relationship. Orpah's choice to return to Moab aligns with cultural expectation. She kisses Naomi goodbye and returns to her people. Scripture does not criticize her decision. It is portrayed as reasonable, even wise. Orpah embodies the path of survival. Her story reminds us that faithfulness does not always require dramatic sacrifice, and that Scripture does not condemn those who choose safety in the face of uncertainty. Ruth's decision, however, moves beyond cultural logic. When she clings to Naomi, refusing to leave, she steps into a future defined by vulnerability. Her famous words are not poetic exaggeration, they are a binding commitment. Ruth aligns herself with Naomi's people and Naomi's God, abandoning her former identity without guarantee of acceptance. This choice is extraordinary within its cultural context. Ruth relinquishes the protection of her own kin. She embraces a land where she will always be marked as an outsider. She binds herself to a woman who believes her own life has been emptied of blessing. Ruth's loyalty is not driven by optimism, it is driven by love. Her vow reveals an early and profound transformation. Ruth does not speak of God as an abstract deity. She chooses Naomi's God as her own, signaling a shift not only in allegiance but in faith. This moment marks Ruth's spiritual turning point, though it is expressed relationally rather than doctrinally. Her faith is lived before it is explained. Culturally, Ruth's decision places her under Israel's legal protections for the vulnerable, but only if those laws are honored. Gleaning laws allowed the poor and the foreigner to gather leftover grain from fields after harvest. These laws reflect God's concern for justice and provision, yet their effectiveness depended on the faithfulness of landowners. Ruth's future will hinge not on her rights alone, but on the kindness of others. The return to Bethlehem introduces another cultural layer, community memory. Naomi is recognized by the women of the town, who ask whether she is the same Naomi they once knew. This recognition underscores how identity in ancient Israel was communal rather than individual. Naomi's grief has altered her so deeply that she feels unrecognizable even to herself. Ruth enters Bethlehem quietly, without introduction or celebration. She is present but unnamed by the community. This silence mirrors her outsider status. Yet Scripture continues to focus on her actions rather than her reception. Ruth's worth will be revealed not through public affirmation, but through quiet perseverance. As Part 2 draws to a close, the cultural and personal foundations of the story are firmly in place. Naomi returns home burdened by loss and unresolved faith. Ruth stands beside her as a foreigner bound by loyalty rather than obligation. The world they enter is governed by ancient customs, fragile justice, and the unpredictable kindness of others. God's faithfulness has not yet been made visible in abundance or resolution. It remains hidden within laws, relationships, and ordinary decisions. Ruth's life, shaped by loss and choice, is now poised to reveal how God works within cultural constraints to bring redemption where none seems possible. The stage is set not for sudden rescue, but for faithful endurance and for a story in which loyalty will become the soil where divine provision quietly takes root. The story of Ruth moves forward not through proclamation or divine decree, but through work humble, repetitive, and physically demanding. When Ruth and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem, they do not enter a season of immediate relief. The famine has ended, but abundance does not fall into their hands. They return with nothing except each other. The early events of Ruth's life in Israel are defined by survival, shaped through faithfulness, and by God's quiet activity within ordinary routines. Bethlehem receives Naomi with recognition, but not with restoration. The women of the town remember her, yet their astonishment only sharpens Naomi's sense of loss. She asks to be called Mara, bitter, believing that her life now bears a name shaped by sorrow rather than delight. Ruth stands beside her during this moment, silent but present. The narrative draws attention not to Ruth's words, but to her posture. She does not correct Naomi's theology or attempt to soften her grief. She remains. This presence becomes Ruth's first act of faithfulness in Israel. She has chosen Naomi's people and God, but that choice immediately places her within vulnerability. Ruth is young, foreign, widowed, and poor. She owns no land, has no legal advocate, and no guarantee of welcome. Yet the story does not frame her as passive. Instead, it introduces Ruth as attentive and willing to act. The timing of their arrival is significant. They come to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This detail anchors the story in the rhythms of agricultural life, but it also signals hope. Harvest represents provision, not abundance for everyone, but opportunity for the poor. The law of Moses had established provisions for gleaning, allowing widows, foreigners, and the poor to gather leftover grain from the edges of fields after reapers had passed through. This law did not eliminate poverty, but it preserved dignity. It required labor rather than charity, participation rather than dependency. Ruth's decision to glean is both practical and courageous. As a Moabite woman, entering the fields of Israelite landowners exposes her to risk. Gleaners were vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, especially women without male protection. Ruth's willingness to go reflects not desperation alone, but trust. She believes that survival lies not in retreat but in engagement. She asks Naomi for permission rather than assuming authority. This detail reflects Ruth's humility and respect. She does not impose her plan, she invites agreement. Naomi offers no elaborate counsel, only quiet consent. Grief has not rendered Naomi careless, but it has limited her expectations. She allows Ruth to go, perhaps unsure what will come of it. Ruth enters the fields and begins to glean behind the harvesters. Scripture emphasizes the ordinariness of this act. Ruth bends, gathers, and carries grain. Her faithfulness is embodied through effort. There is no divine voice, no angelic intervention. God's presence remains unspoken, yet the narrative invites readers to notice something else. Providence unfolding through what appears to be coincidence. Ruth happens to glean in a field belonging to Boaz, a relative of Elimelech. The language deliberately avoids attributing this directly to God, yet the implication is clear. God's faithfulness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly through human paths that seem accidental but are not random. Boaz enters the story not as a hero, but as a landowner attentive to his workers. His greeting, "The Lord be with you," and their response, "The Lord bless you," reveal a shared faith woven into daily life. This exchange contrasts sharply with the moral chaos often associated with the time of the judges. It signals that even in unstable times, pockets of covenant faithfulness remain. Boaz notices Ruth not because she draws attention to herself, but because he sees diligence where others might overlook it. He asks about her, and his foreman identifies her not by name, but by story, the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. Ruth's identity remains tethered to her outside status, yet her reputation precedes her. She has worked steadily since morning with little rest. When Boaz speaks to Ruth, his words are protective rather than possessive. He instructs her to stay close to his female workers and assures her safety. He commands the men not to touch her, an explicit acknowledgement of the vulnerability she faces. This protection is not owed to Ruth by law, it is given freely. Boaz's actions reveal how God's covenant values are lived through human kindness. Ruth's response is striking. She falls face down, questioning why she has found favor as a foreigner. Her humility is not false modesty. She understands the social distance between herself and Boaz. His kindness surprises her because she does not expect inclusion. This moment highlights one of the book's central tensions, God's grace reaching beyond expected boundaries through faithful people. Boaz explains his actions by naming Ruth's loyalty. He knows what she has done for Naomi, how she left her parents, her land, and her people. Ruth's earlier choice now bears witness. Her faithfulness, unseen by many, has been noticed. This acknowledgement affirms that loyalty practiced quietly still matters. Boaz's blessing invokes the God Israel as refuge. He recognizes Ruth's commitment not merely as familial devotion, but as spiritual trust. Without formal ceremony, Ruth's faith is acknowledged and honored. This moment affirms that belonging to God's people is not limited to birth, but extended through faith and loyalty. At mealtime, Boaz invites Ruth to eat with the harvesters. This gesture carries symbolic weight. Eating together represents acceptance and safety. Ruth is no longer merely tolerated in the field. She is welcomed into shared provision. Boaz ensures she has enough and even instructs his workers to leave extra grain for her deliberately. Yet the narrative is careful not to frame this generosity as romantic or transactional. Boaz does not exploit his power. Ruth does not manipulate kindness. Their interaction remains dignified, shaped by respect rather than entitlement. This restraint is essential. The story's redemption will emerge through integrity, not impulse. Ruth returns to Naomi with an abundance of grain. The physical evidence of provision confronts Naomi's bitterness. For the first time since returning to Bethlehem, Naomi speaks a blessing. She recognizes that the Lord has not abandoned the living or the dead. This moment marks a subtle shift in Naomi's theology. Hope does not arrive through explanation, but through experience. When Naomi learns the name of the landowner, recognition dawns. Boaz is a redeemer, a relative with the potential to restore what has been lost. This realization does not immediately resolve the story, but it introduces possibility. Naomi begins to see that God's faithfulness may be unfolding even now, through ordinary faithfulness lived by Ruth. Ruth's early days in Israel establish a pattern that will define her life. She works diligently without complaint. She receives kindness without entitlement. She remains loyal without knowing the outcome. Her faith is not expressed through public declaration, but through consistency. In this, Ruth embodies a theology of everyday obedience. These early events reveal that God's faithfulness often enters through provision before explanation. Ruth and Naomi are fed before they are secure, hopeful before they are restored. The story resists urgency. It allows redemption to grow slowly, like grain in the field. As part 3 concludes, Ruth stands no longer as a woman simply surviving, but as one whose faithfulness has begun to bear fruit. Boaz has noticed her. Naomi has been stirred toward hope. The harvest continues, and with it the quiet unfolding of God's plan. The road ahead remains uncertain, but the foundation has been laid. Loyalty has met kindness. Work has met provision. And in the ordinary spaces of field and table, God's faithfulness has begun to move, from hidden presence to visible grace. As the barley harvest gives way to the wheat harvest, the story of Ruth enters a more complex and decisive phase. What began as survival through gleaning now moves toward questions of future security and redemption. The narrative slows deliberately, drawing attention to choices that must be made carefully within both cultural custom and moral restraint. The major turning points of Ruth's life do not come through sudden intervention, but through discernment exercised in the midst of uncertainty. The first major turning point unfolds within Naomi herself. Until now, Naomi has largely interpreted her life through the lens of loss. Her bitterness has shaped her expectations, narrowing her vision of what God might still do. Yet Ruth's daily return from the fields laden with grain begins to soften this posture. Naomi observes not only provision but consistency. Ruth returns each evening tired yet faithful, carrying tangible evidence that God has not abandoned them. Naomi's transformation is subtle but significant. She begins to think again not merely about survival but about future rest for Ruth. This concern reflects a shift from despair to responsibility. Naomi's grief does not vanish, but it loosens its grip enough for hope to enter. She remembers the laws of kinship and redemption, recognizing that Boaz is not merely kind, but a potential redeemer. In ancient Israel, the concept of a kinsman redeemer carried legal and social weight. A redeemer could restore land that had been lost due to poverty, preserve a family line, and protect vulnerable relatives from permanent destitution. Redemption was not an abstract idea. It was enacted through costly responsibility. Yet the law did not compel a redeemer to act automatically. It required willingness. This realization introduces tension into the narrative. Boaz's kindness has been generous, but kindness alone does not guarantee redemption. Ruth's future remains uncertain. Naomi now faces a question shaped by both hope and risk. How can Ruth's security be sought without compromising dignity or integrity? The plan Naomi proposes is careful, culturally grounded, and restrained, yet modern readers often misinterpret its intention. Naomi instructs Ruth to wait until Boaz has finished threshing grain at the threshing floor, a place associated with celebration and provision. Ruth is told to prepare herself, approach Boaz discreetly, and lie at his feet after he has lain down. This act is symbolic rather than seductive. To uncover one's feet is a gesture of petition, not provocation. It places Ruth in a posture of humility, asking for protection rather than asserting entitlement. This moment represents a major turning point for Ruth. Up to this point, she has acted publicly, gleaning in the fields, working among others. Now she is asked to act privately, trusting both Naomi's guidance and Boaz's character. The risk is real. Misinterpretation could damage her reputation permanently, yet Ruth does not resist. She responds with the same words she spoke at the beginning of her journey. "All that you say I will do." Her loyalty remains intact, now expressed through obedience rather than endurance. The threshing floor scene is charged with tension, but it unfolds with remarkable restraint. Ruth waits quietly until Boaz has finished eating and drinking and lies down. She approaches silently and lies at his feet. When Boaz awakens, startled, Ruth identifies herself and asks him to spread his garment over her, for he is a redeemer. This request is both bold and humble. Ruth does not demand marriage. She appeals to Boaz's role within God's covenant framework. Boaz's response marks one of the most significant turning points in the story. He does not react with anger, suspicion, or exploitation. Instead, he blesses Ruth for her kindness, noting that she has not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. His words reveal that Ruth's actions are understood as faithfulness rather than opportunism. Her loyalty continues to define her character, yet a new conflict emerges. Boaz acknowledges that while he is a redeemer, there is another relative closer than he. This legal reality introduces uncertainty. Redemption cannot proceed immediately. The law must be honored. Boaz promises to resolve the matter publicly and righteously, either by redeeming Ruth himself or ensuring that the closer redeemer fulfills the role. This delay is significant. It tests Ruth's trust and patience once more. The story resists a simplistic resolution. God's faithfulness does not bypass legal complexity or communal accountability. Instead, it moves through them. Boaz sends Ruth home before dawn, protecting her reputation, and provides additional grain, a tangible sign of care and assurance. Naomi receives Ruth with cautious anticipation. When Ruth recounts Boaz's words and actions, Naomi responds with confidence that contrasts sharply with her earlier bitterness. She instructs Ruth to wait, expressing trust that Boaz will not rest until the matter is settled. This shift reveals Naomi's renewed faith, not in circumstance, but in God's unfolding work through faithful people. The public resolution at the city gate becomes the final major turning point. Boaz gathers the elders and presents the matter openly. The closer redeemer initially agrees to redeem the land associated with Elimelech, but withdraws when he learns that redemption includes marriage to Ruth, a Moabite woman. This hesitation exposes underlying fears of financial loss, diluted inheritance, or social complication. The law allows him to step aside, and he does so publicly. Boaz's willingness now stands in contrast. He accepts the cost of redemption fully, including Ruth. His commitment is not based on convenience but on covenant responsibility. In doing so, he restores Naomi's land, secures Ruth's future, and preserves the family line. The elders and people bless the union, invoking the legacy of Israel's matriarchs and affirming Ruth's place within the community. This moment resolves the central conflict of the story, not merely Ruth's vulnerability, but her outsider status. Ruth, once a foreign widow gleaning at the margins, is now publicly named and blessed as part of Israel's future. The turning point is not marked by spectacle, but by legal clarity, communal affirmation, and covenant faithfulness lived out fully. These major turning points reveal that redemption often requires courage, patience, and integrity from all involved. Naomi must risk hope. Ruth must trust wisely. Boaz must act justly. God's faithfulness emerges through their cooperation, not despite their restraint. As Part 4 concludes, the story has moved decisively from survival to restoration. The conflicts, legal, social, and personal, have been navigated without compromise. Ruth's loyalty has been honored. Naomi's bitterness has begun to lift. And God's faithfulness, once hidden within fan and loss, now stands visible within redeemed relationship and renewed future. Yet the story is not finished. What has been restored will soon become the foundation for something far greater than anyone present could imagine. The faithfulness shown in these turning points will echo beyond individual lives, shaping generations yet to come. The outward resolution of Ruth's circumstances does not erase the inward journeys that have shaped her and Naomi along the way. Beneath the legal proceedings, the harvest celebrations, and the public blessings lies a quieter transformation, one forged through spiritual struggle, persistent faith, and the slow reshaping of hope. The Book of Ruth is as much about what happens within the hearts of its characters as it is about what happens around them. In this sense, Ruth's life becomes a study in how God forms faith not through sudden deliverance, but through sustained trust amid uncertainty. Ruth's spiritual struggle begins long before she reaches Bethlehem. Her decision to follow Naomi is often remembered for its beauty, but its cost is sometimes understated. Ruth leaves behind not only her homeland and family, but the gods, customs, and assumptions that once structured her life. Scripture does not record a dramatic conversion experience, yet her vow reveals a decisive reorientation of allegiance. She entrusts herself to the God of Israel without guarantee of provision or acceptance. This act of faith is not abstract belief, it is embodied risk. Upon entering Israel, Ruth's faith is immediately tested by vulnerability. Her new identity does not shield her from hunger, fatigue, or danger. Gleaning in the fields is physically exhausting and socially precarious. Ruth must learn to live as one who trusts God, not for exemption from hardship, but for presence within it. Each day she steps into the fields without assurance of kindness, relying instead on the hope that God's laws of provision will be honored by human hands. This daily dependence shapes Ruth's spirituality. Her faith is not expressed through ritual or public prayer, but through perseverance. She rises early, works steadily, and returns with what she has gathered. The repetition of this routine reflects a faith grounded in constancy rather than intensity. Ruth's spirituality is not marked by emotional highs, but by quiet endurance. In this, she embodies a form of devotion often overlooked, the faith that persists without visible affirmation. Naomi's spiritual struggle unfolds differently. Her journey is marked by lament rather than endurance. Naomi interprets her losses as divine opposition, believing that God has dealt bitterly with her. Yet her struggle is not framed as rebellion. She does not deny God's sovereignty. She questions his kindness. This distinction is crucial. Naomi's lament reflects a faith that remains engaged even in pain. She speaks to God honestly, refusing to mask grief behind polite theology. As Ruth labors in the fields, Naomi watches from a place of stillness. Her struggle is internal. She must confront the possibility that her understanding of God's work has been incomplete. The return of grain day after day begins to unsettle her certainty that blessing has ended. This slow reawakening of hope is not immediate relief. It is a gradual loosening of despair's grip. The threshing floor episode intensifies Ruth's spiritual testing. For the first time, she is asked not merely to endure, but to hope actively. Approaching Boaz at night requires courage, humility, and trust. Ruth must entrust herself not only to God, but to the integrity of another person. This moment exposes the vulnerability inherent in faith. Ruth cannot control the outcome. She can only act faithfully within the boundaries of righteousness and wait. Boaz's response affirms Ruth's character, yet introduces delay. The presence of a closer Redeemer complicates the path forward. This delay becomes another spiritual test. Ruth must learn to wait once more, this time not in scarcity, but in expectation. Waiting in hope often proves more difficult than waiting in despair because it opens the heart to potential disappointment. Ruth's willingness to wait reveals a faith no longer driven solely by survival but by trust in God's timing. Naomi's transformation reaches a critical moment during this waiting. Her earlier bitterness gives way to confidence, not in circumstances but in character. She trusts that Boaz will act honorably. More deeply, she begins to trust that God's faithfulness is active even when outcomes remain unresolved. This shift marks a profound spiritual healing. Naomi does not receive back what she lost, but she receives something else, the ability to hope again. The public resolution at the city gate brings closure to external uncertainty, but the inner transformation continues. Ruth's inclusion within Israel is now affirmed by law and community. Yet her spiritual journey does not end with security. Marriage does not erase the memory of loss or the vulnerability that shaped her faith. Instead, it becomes the context in which her faithfulness is given new expression. The birth of a son marks another moment of transformation, particularly for Naomi. The women of Bethlehem rejoice, declaring that Naomi has a redeemer and that her life will be restored. They name the child Obed, emphasizing continuity and future. This communal joy contrasts sharply with Naomi's earlier lament. The same community that witnessed her return in bitterness now witnesses her restoration through relationship, rather than reversal of loss. Naomi's transformation is perhaps the most striking spiritual arc in the story. She begins convinced that God's hand is against her. She ends holding a child who represents not only personal comfort, but renewed place within God's unfolding promise. Yet Scripture is careful not to present this as a simplistic reward. Naomi's losses are not undone. Elimelech and her sons remain gone. Her healing comes not through replacement, but through renewal of meaning. Ruth's transformation is quieter but no less profound. She moves from foreign widow to honored member of Israel's community. More importantly, she moves from risk-filled loyalty to secure belonging without losing the humility that defined her journey. Ruth does not claim entitlement based on her faithfulness. She receives blessing as gift rather than achievement. This posture reflects a faith matured through dependence rather than control. The spiritual struggles within Ruth's life reveal a theology of formation rather than instant fulfillment. God does not remove Ruth from vulnerability immediately. He allows her faith to be shaped by work, waiting, and trust in others. Her transformation emerges through relationship, first with Naomi, then with Boaz, and finally with the wider community. Faith, in this narrative, is never solitary. The story also reveals how God works through human character to bring healing. Boaz's integrity, Naomi's guidance, and Ruth's loyalty all become instruments of divine faithfulness. God's transformation does not bypass human agency, it redeems it. The spiritual growth of each character is intertwined with the faithfulness of the others. Perhaps the deepest transformation lies in how suffering is reinterpreted. For Naomi, suffering once meant divine abandonment. By the end, it becomes part of a story through which God's faithfulness is revealed. For Ruth, suffering becomes the context in which her devotion is refined. Neither woman is promised a life free from pain. Instead, they are given a life in which pain does not have the final word. As Part 5 concludes, the inner journeys of Ruth and Naomi stand as testimonies to a God who forms faith patiently. Their spiritual struggles do not disqualify them, they shape them. Loss becomes soil for loyalty. Waiting becomes space for trust. Vulnerability becomes the doorway to transformation. The life of Ruth teaches that God's faithfulness often meets us not at the end of struggle, but within it, reshaping hearts long before circumstances change. This inner work prepares the way for a greater unfolding of purpose, one that will extend far beyond the immediate restoration Ruth and Naomi experienced. The climax of Ruth's story arrives not with spectacle, but with quiet fulfillment, when faithfulness practiced in obscurity is gathered into a moment of lasting consequence. What has been patiently built through loyalty, integrity, and trust now converges in an outcome that neither Ruth nor Naomi could have anticipated at the beginning of their journey. the narrative slows, allowing the weight of this convergence to be felt. Redemption, long hoped for and carefully pursued, is realized not as an abstract idea, but as embodied life. Boaz's act of redemption at the city gate marks the formal turning point, but the true climax unfolds in what follows. By publicly accepting the role of Redeemer, Boaz binds himself to Ruth, not merely through marriage, but through covenant responsibility. This commitment restores Naomi's land, secures Ruth's future, and preserves the name of the dead within Israel. Yet the story's deepest significance lies not in legal restoration alone, but in how God's faithfulness becomes visible through the joining of lives once shaped by loss. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz is presented without flourish. Scripture offers no description of ceremony or celebration beyond the communal blessing. This restraint is intentional. The story resists romanticization, emphasizing instead the weight of covenant fulfilled. Ruth's journey has never been about romance. It has been about belonging, provision, and faithfulness. The marriage represents the culmination of these themes, not their replacement. The text then turns to what follows from this union. The Lord grants Ruth conception, and she gives birth to a son. This moment is significant, not only because it brings joy, but because it signals divine involvement explicitly. For the first time in the narrative, God's action is stated directly. The Lord gives life. The famine that once drove Naomi from Bethlehem is now replaced by fruitfulness. Yet the narrative does not rush past this moment. It lingers, inviting reflection on how quietly God has been at work all along. What is striking is how the birth of the child is framed. The women of Bethlehem gather around Naomi, not Ruth, and bless her. They proclaim that Naomi has a redeemer and that her life is restored. This communal response reveals the depth of Naomi's transformation. The woman who once declared herself bitter now receives blessing and affirmation from the same community that witnessed her return in grief. Her emptiness has been filled not through reversal of loss, but through renewed purpose and connection. The child is named Obed, meaning servant. This name carries symbolic weight. Obed will serve as a bridge between generations, linking past loss to future promise. Naomi takes the child and cares for him, image of restored nurture and belonging. The woman who believed her story had ended now holds the next chapter in her arms. This moment represents the climax, not because it resolves every sorrow, but because it reveals how God redeems without erasing pain. Elimelech and Naomi's sons remain gone. Ruth's past as a foreigner does not vanish. Yet the narrative affirms that God's faithfulness is not dependent on undoing tragedy. It works through it, transforming its meaning and extending its impact. The final verses of the book draw the reader's gaze outward. A genealogy is introduced, tracing the line from Perez to Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and David. This shift from intimate story to ancestral record is deliberate. It reframes everything that has come before. The loyalty of Ruth, the kindness of Boaz, and the endurance of Naomi are revealed as part of a much larger unfolding purpose. David, Israel's future king, emerges from this lineage. The story that began with famine and displacement now stands at the threshold of national transformation. Ruth, the Moabite widow, becomes the great-grandmother of a king. This revelation is not presented with triumphalism, but with quiet awe. God's faithfulness, once hidden in gleaning fields and midnight conversations, now stands woven into the foundation of Israel's future. This climactic revelation challenges assumptions about how God works in history. The path to kingship does not pass through palaces or battlefields in this story. It passes through loyalty between widows, integrity in landowners, and faithfulness practiced in daily labor. The Book of Ruth suggests that God's redemptive purposes often advance through lives that appear insignificant by worldly standards. The climax also reframes Ruth's identity fully. She is no longer defined as the Moabite woman, though Scripture does not erase her origin. Instead, her faithfulness redefines her place within God's people. Ruth's inclusion within the genealogy of David and later within the lineage of the Messiah declares that God's covenant faithfulness extends beyond ethnic and cultural boundaries. What once marked Ruth as an outsider now becomes part of a testimony to God's expansive grace. Naomi's arc reaches its fulfillment here as well. Her journey from fullness to emptiness and back again reveals a theology shaped by lived experience. She learns that God's faithfulness is not always immediate or easily understood. It unfolds across time, often through the faithfulness of others. Naomi's restoration comes not through explanation, but through participation in God's unfolding work. The climactic significance of Ruth's story lies in this layered redemption. Land is restored. Lineage is preserved, identity is renewed, community is healed. Yet none of these outcomes occur through force or spectacle. They occur through covenant lived faithfully within ordinary life. This climax invites the reader to reconsider where they expect God's work to appear. Ruth's story insists that divine faithfulness often reveals itself not in moments of visible power, but in the long obedience of love. God's plan advances through human choices aligned with his character choices marked by loyalty, humility, and trust. As Part 6 concludes, the full weight of Ruth's journey comes into view. What began as a story of survival has become a story of salvation not only for individuals but for a people. The loyalty of a foreign widow has become the channel through which God's faithfulness flows into Israel's future. The climax of Ruth's life does not elevate her above others. It places her within God's redemptive story. Her faithfulness, once practiced in obscurity, now stands revealed as essential. Through Ruth's, Scripture declares that God's faithfulness meets human loyalty in ways that echo far beyond what faithfulness alone could ever achieve. The Book of Ruth speaks with a quiet authority that deepens the more it is contemplated. Its power does not come from prophetic speeches or miraculous signs, but from the way God's message is revealed through faithfulness lived patiently in ordinary circumstances. Beneath the simplicity of its narrative lies a rich theological tapestry, offering insight into God's character, his purposes, and the way he invites human participation in redemption. At the heart of Ruth's story is the revelation that God's faithfulness is often most active where it seems most absent. At no point in the narrative does God speak directly to Ruth or Naomi. There are no visions, no divine commands, no explicit explanations for suffering or delay. Yet God's presence permeates the story. This absence of overt divine speech is itself a message. It teaches that God's faithfulness does not depend on constant visibility. He works steadily through provision, timing, and relationship, even when his voice is not heard. This quiet faithfulness challenges expectations about how God should act. In a world that often equates divine presence with dramatic intervention, Ruth's story insists that God is just as present in gleaning fields as in sacred spaces. The ordinary becomes holy when lived in alignment with God's character. Ruth's daily labor, Boaz's integrity, and Naomi's gradual return to hope become channels of divine purpose. God's message here is clear: faithfulness in small things matters deeply. Another central theme is Hesed's steadfast love, covenant loyalty. This word, though not always explicitly stated, shapes the entire narrative. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, Boaz's kindness toward Ruth, and God's ongoing care for his people all reflect this covenantal love. Hesed is not emotional affection alone. It is love expressed through action, commitment, and responsibility. Ruth's story teaches that God's love is not abstract. It is embodied through faithful relationships. Ruth's choice to remain with Naomi reveals a deeper truth about belonging. God's covenant is not limited by ethnicity or origin, but extended through faithfulness and trust. Ruth, a Moabite woman, becomes part of Israel not through conquest or assimilation, but through devotion and humility. God's message here confronts narrow definitions of inclusion. He is a God who welcomes outsiders and weaves them into his redemptive plan without erasing their identity. This inclusivity does not negate Israel's unique calling. It fulfills it. Through Ruth, Scripture shows that God's covenant with Israel was never meant to be insular. It was always intended to bless beyond itself. Ruth's inclusion anticipates a broader vision of redemption, one that reaches across boundaries through love rather than force. God's message through Ruth affirms that faithfulness, not pedigree, defines belonging. The role of Boaz further reveals God's heart for justice. Boaz does not exploit his position of power. He honors both the spirit and the letter of the law. His protection of Ruth in the fields, his restraint at the threshing floor, and his public transparency at the city gate all reflect a righteousness shaped by compassion. God's message here is that true righteousness safeguards the vulnerable. It does not seek advantage, but assumes responsibility. Boaz's willingness to redeem Ruth at personal cost mirrors God's own redemptive nature. Redemption in Ruth's story is not transactional, it is sacrificial. Boaz restores land, lineage, and security, not because it benefits him economically, but because it aligns with covenant faithfulness. Through Boaz, Scripture reveals that God's faithfulness is often expressed through people who choose integrity over convenience. Naomi's journey carries its own theological weight. Her lament is not silenced or corrected by Scripture. Instead, it is allowed to stand within the narrative. God's message here is one of compassion toward honest grief. Naomi's bitterness does not disqualify her from God's care. Her story affirms that faith can coexist with sorrow, and that lament can be part of faithful relationship with God. As Naomi's perspective slowly changes, the story illustrates how God heals not by erasing pain, but by restoring meaning. Naomi does not receive back what she lost. Her husband and sons do not return. Yet her emptiness is filled through renewed relationship and future hope. God's faithfulness is revealed not in reversal, but in transformation. Loss becomes part of a larger story rather than its conclusion. The birth of Obed reveals another layer of God's message. Life emerges where death once dominated the narrative. This is not merely personal joy, it is theological declaration. God is a giver of life who brings continuity out of rupture. Obed's birth connects past suffering to future promise, demonstrating that God's redemptive work often unfolds across generations. The genealogy at the end of the book anchors Ruth's story within salvation history by linking Ruth to David. Scripture reveals that God's purposes extend far beyond individual lives. Ruth's loyalty, Naomi's endurance, and Boaz's integrity become part of a story that shapes Israel's future. God's message here is one of scale and patience. Faithfulness, practiced quietly, may influence outcomes far beyond what is immediately visible. This perspective invites humility. Ruth does not act with knowledge of her future significance. She does not know she will be remembered, honored, or included in royal lineage. She acts out of love and commitment in the present. God's message through her life teaches that obedience does not require foresight. Faithfulness is meaningful even when its full impact remains unseen. Another deeper meaning emerges in the contrast between human initiative and divine providence. Ruth chooses to glean. Boaz chooses to protect. Naomi chooses to hope again. These human decisions are real and consequential, yet Scripture frames them within God's overarching care. God's faithfulness does not negate human agency, it works through it. The story affirms a partnership between divine purpose and human obedience. Ruth's story also speaks to the dignity of work. Gleaning is not glamorous, it is labor-intensive and often overlooked. Yet God's faithfulness meets Ruth precisely there. The narrative honors work done in humility, revealing that God values faithfulness expressed through effort. This challenges any notion that spiritual significance is limited to sacred or extraordinary acts. Finally, the deeper meaning of Ruth's life lies in its testimony to hope rooted in relationship. Ruth's faith is expressed not through solitary devotion, but through commitment to others. Naomi's healing comes not through explanation, but through companionship. Boaz's righteousness is lived out in community accountability. God's message through Ruth affirms that redemption is relational at its core. The Book of Ruth teaches that God's faithfulness is patient, inclusive, and deeply attentive to the vulnerable. It reveals a God who works quietly yet decisively, honoring loyalty and integrity wherever they are found. Through Ruth's life, Scripture proclaims that love lived faithfully, especially when it is costly, becomes the very place where God's redemptive purposes take root. The story of Ruth may belong to an ancient agricultural society, yet its wisdom presses powerfully into the realities of modern life. Beneath its historical setting lies a pattern of faith that remains deeply relevant, one that speaks to migration, loss, loyalty, work, identity, and trust in God's faithfulness when the future feels uncertain. Ruth's life offers not a formula for success, but a way of living faithfully amid instability, a challenge that resonates strongly in a world marked by constant change. One of the most immediate applications of Ruth's story lies in how it addresses displacement. Ruth is a migrant woman, leaving her homeland behind not for opportunity, but for loyalty. In today's world, millions live as migrants or refugees, often carrying grief, uncertainty, and cultural marginalization. Ruth's story affirms that God sees those who live between worlds. Her dignity is not derived from her nationality or security, but from her faithfulness and courage. For modern readers, this challenges assumptions about worth and belonging, reminding us that God's redemptive work often moves through those society overlooks. Ruth's loyalty also speaks into a culture that prizes self-advancement. Her choice to remain with Naomi runs counter to modern instincts that prioritize personal gain, independence, and efficiency. Ruth does not ask what will benefit her most. She asks whom she will remain faithful to. This challenges contemporary definitions of wisdom. Ruth's life suggests that faithfulness to people and commitments may be more transformative than strategic self-interest. Loyalty, in this sense, becomes a spiritual discipline rather than a sentimental virtue. The way Ruth lives out her faith through work carries particular relevance today. Gleaning is not glamorous labor. It is repetitive, physically demanding, and often invisible. Yet it becomes the primary setting where God's faithfulness unfolds. In a modern world where value is often tied to visibility, status, or productivity metrics, Ruth's story affirms the dignity of ordinary work done faithfully. God's provision meets Ruth not when she waits passively, but when she engages fully in the work available to her. This has implications for how modern believers view their own labor. Whether in offices, homes, fields, or unseen roles, Ruth's story reminds us that faithfulness expressed through daily responsibility matters. God's purposes are not limited to overtly religious settings. They often take shape through consistency, humility, and perseverance in ordinary tasks. Ruth's willingness to take initiative without entitlement also offers guidance for navigating opportunity today. She seeks permission before gleaning. She responds to kindness with gratitude rather than expectation. Even when Boaz shows favor, Ruth does not presume upon it. This posture contrasts sharply with a culture that often frames opportunity as something to be claimed or demanded. Ruth's story suggests that trust, humility, and respect for boundaries create space for genuine provision and relationship. Naomi's journey speaks directly to modern experiences of grief and disillusionment. Many people carry losses that reshape their understanding of God and life itself. Naomi's honesty about her bitterness challenges the pressure to mask pain with optimism. Scripture does not silence her lament, and neither should modern faith communities. Ruth's story affirms that faith can coexist with sorrow and that questioning God's kindness does not sever relationship with Him. At the same time, Naomi's gradual healing offers hope to those who feel trapped in despair. Her restoration does not come through explanation or reversal of loss, but through renewed relationship and purpose. This speaks to modern grief that may never find full resolution. Ruth's story encourages patience with the healing process, affirming that hope often returns quietly, shaped by daily evidence of care rather than sudden relief. Boaz's example offers a powerful model of ethical leadership and integrity. He holds power as a landowner, yet he uses it to protect rather than exploit. In workplaces, institutions, and communities today, Boaz's behavior challenges leaders to consider how their decisions affect the vulnerable. His integrity is not performative, it is practical. He honors laws meant to protect the poor, not because he must, but because he chooses to reflect God's character. This has direct application in modern conversations about justice. Ruth's story shows that systems matter, but so do individuals who choose to uphold them faithfully. God's provision for Ruth depends not only on the existence of gleaning laws, but on Boaz's willingness to honor their intent. Modern believers are invited to consider how they might embody justice within their own spheres of influence. Ruth's identity as an outsider who becomes fully included challenges modern assumptions about belonging. In a world often divided by race, culture, class, and belief, Ruth's story affirms that faithfulness and character carry greater weight than origin. Her inclusion does not erase difference, it redeems it. This offers a vision of community rooted not in uniformity but in shared commitment and mutual care. The threshing floor episode also provides wisdom for navigating vulnerability and trust. Ruth approaches Boaz with humility and clarity, acting within cultural boundaries and moral integrity. This moment speaks to modern relationships shaped by imbalance of power or uncertainty. Ruth's story encourages courage paired with wisdom, vulnerability shaped by discernment, and trust grounded in character rather than impulse. Another modern application lies in the theme of waiting. Ruth's story unfolds slowly. There are no shortcuts to redemption. Waiting occurs in hunger, in hope, and in expectation. Modern life often resists waiting, treating it as failure or inefficiency. Ruth's journey reframes waiting as formative space where faith deepens and trust nurtures. God's faithfulness unfolds not in haste, but in time. Ruth's story also speaks to those who feel their lives are small or insignificant. Ruth does not act with awareness of her future impact. She does not know she will become part of a royal lineage. She simply chooses faithfulness in front of her. This offers reassurance to modern believers who wonder whether their choices matter. Scripture affirms that faithfulness practiced quietly can echo far beyond immediate circumstances. The communal aspect of Ruth's restoration offers further application. Healing comes through relationship through Naomi's guidance, Boaz's integrity, and communal affirmation. Modern faith often emphasizes personal spirituality, yet Ruth's story reminds us that transformation is relational. God's faithfulness is often mediated through others who show up consistently and compassionately. Finally, Ruth's life invites modern readers to reconsider how they define success. Ruth's success is not measured by independence, wealth, or recognition. It is measured by faithfulness, belonging, and participation in God's redemptive work. Her story challenges metrics driven by self-advancement and invites a vision of life shaped by loyalty and trust. Applied to modern life, Ruth's story becomes an invitation to live faithfully without certainty, to love without guarantee, and to work diligently even when outcomes remain unclear. It reassures those navigating loss, migration, or marginalization that God's faithfulness often meets them through ordinary kindness and daily provision. Ruth's life reminds us that God's work is not confined to dramatic moments. It unfolds through consistent love, ethical choices, and trust sustained over time. In a world longing for stability and meaning, Ruth's story offers a quiet but powerful assurance. Faithfulness practiced today may become the foundation of hope for tomorrow. The story of Ruth invites a kind of reflection that deepens with time. It does not rush the reader toward conclusions, nor does it offer simple moral formulas. Instead, it draws us into a narrative where faith is revealed through ordinary choices, where God's work is subtle yet certain, and where loyalty becomes the language through which divine faithfulness is made visible. The lessons of Ruth's life are not abstract principles imposed on the story. They rise naturally from lived experience shaped by loss, courage, and trust. One of the most enduring lessons of Ruth's story is that faithfulness often begins where security ends. Ruth's defining choice to remain with Naomi places her in a position of vulnerability rather than safety. She chooses uncertainty over familiarity, poverty over protection, and obscurity over belonging. This teaches that faith is not always aligned with comfort. Often, it requires stepping away from what is known and trusting God in spaces where guarantees are absent. Ruth's life reminds us that faithfulness is sometimes most visible when it costs the most. Another lesson emerges from the contrast between Ruth and Orpah. Both women face the same crossroads, and both choices are understandable. Scripture does not condemn Orpah, yet it highlights Ruth. This distinction teaches that faithfulness is not measured by what is permissible, but by what is pursued. Ruth's story invites reflection on how different paths, equally reasonable on the surface, can lead to profoundly different outcomes. It challenges readers to consider not only what they are allowed to do, but what love and loyalty might call them to do. The narrative also teaches that God's faithfulness does not eliminate hardship immediately. Ruth's loyalty does not lead to instant security. Instead, it leads to gleaning hard work, long days, and ongoing dependence. This lesson resists the assumption that obedience guarantees ease. Ruth's story affirms that God's faithfulness often sustains us through difficulty before it delivers us from it. Provision may arrive gradually, shaped through effort rather than abundance. A deeper reflection arises from the way God's presence is woven into the story without dominating it. God is rarely mentioned directly, yet his faithfulness permeates every chapter. This teaches that God's work is not limited to moments of obvious intervention. He is active in timing, in relationships, and in what appears to be coincidence. Ruth's story encourages attentiveness to God's presence in ordinary life, reminding readers that divine faithfulness often operates quietly. The character of Naomi offers another important lesson. Her bitterness is not censured by Scripture. Instead, it is held alongside God's unfolding care. Naomi's journey teaches that lament has a place within faith. Honest grief does not disqualify one from God's purposes. In fact, Naomi's story suggests that God meets people within their sorrow, allowing space for healing rather than demanding immediate resolution. This lesson speaks powerfully to those who struggle to reconcile faith with pain. Naomi's transformation also teaches that restoration does not always mean replacement. Her losses are real and permanent, yet her life is renewed through relationship and future hope. This reframes how healing is understood. God's faithfulness does not always undo what has been lost. Sometimes it reorients life around new meaning. Ruth's story invites reflection on how God redeems loss by weaving it into a larger narrative rather than erasing it. The role of Boaz highlights lessons about integrity and responsibility. Boaz is not compelled to act generously beyond what the law requires, yet he chooses to do so. His actions teach that righteousness is not merely about compliance, but about character. He honors the vulnerable, respects boundaries, and submits to communal accountability. Ruth's story affirms that God's faithfulness is often revealed through people who choose integrity even when convenience offers another path. The threshing floor episode offers a particularly nuanced lesson. It demonstrates how faithfulness navigates risk without abandoning wisdom. Ruth acts boldly yet with restraint. She follows Naomi's guidance and trusts Boaz's character without presuming upon it. This moment teaches that faith is not reckless. It balances courage with discernment, vulnerability with integrity. The story invites reflection on how trust can be exercised wisely in uncertain situations. Another lesson lies in the significance of waiting. Ruth waits through seasons of hunger, through harvest cycles, and through legal resolution. Waiting becomes a form of faithfulness rather than a sign of passivity. This challenges modern discomfort with delay. Ruth's story teaches that waiting can be active, purposeful, and spiritually formative. God's timing, though often slower than human desire, unfolds with intention. The inclusion of Ruth within Israel's community and lineage offers a profound lesson about belonging. Ruth's identity as a Moabite is not erased, yet it no longer defines her exclusion. This teaches that God's covenant is expansive. Belonging is shaped by faithfulness rather than origin. Ruth's life challenges assumptions about who is included in God's purposes. revealing a God who welcomes outsiders and reshapes boundaries through love. The genealogy at the end of the book extends this lesson further. Ruth's faithfulness, practiced without knowledge of future impact, becomes part of Israel's royal line. This invites reflection on the unseen consequences of obedience. Ruth does not act with awareness of legacy. She simply acts in love and loyalty. The lesson here is humility. Faithfulness is meaningful even when its full significance remains hidden. And another reflection arises from the communal nature of redemption in the story. Ruth's restoration does not occur in isolation. It involves Naomi's guidance, Boaz's willingness, and the affirmation of elders and neighbors. This highlights that God's faithfulness often unfolds within community. Redemption is shared, witnessed, and sustained by collective responsibility. The story invites reflection on how modern faith communities can become spaces where loyalty and care are practiced together. Ruth's story also teaches about the dignity of ordinary lives. The narrative does not center on kings or warriors until its final lines. For most of the story, the focus remains on widows and fields, meals and work. This emphasis teaches that God's redemptive work is not reserved for the powerful. Ordinary faithfulness holds extraordinary significance in God's economy. The extended lesson of Ruth's life is one of trust, sustained over time. Ruth trusts Naomi, trusts God's provision, trusts Boaz's integrity, and trusts a future she cannot see. Her faith is not dramatic, but it is durable. It endures loss, uncertainty, and waiting. This durability becomes her legacy. As readers reflect on Ruth's story, they are invited to examine their own definitions of success, faithfulness, and hope. Ruth's life suggests that success may look like staying when leaving would be easier, working when giving up would be understandable, and trusting when outcomes remain unclear. Faithfulness, in this vision, is not measured by immediate reward, but by consistent devotion. Ultimately, the lessons of Ruth's story converge on this truth. God's faithfulness meets human loyalty in ways that exceed expectation, not by bypassing hardship, but by redeeming it, not by erasing vulnerability, but by honoring it. Ruth's life teaches that love lived faithfully becomes the very place where God's purposes take root and grow. This extended reflection prepares us for the story's quiet conclusion, one that does not demand admiration but invites imitation. Ruth's legacy is not her fame but her faithfulness, and in that faithfulness, God's enduring faithfulness is revealed. The story of Ruth comes to its close not with spectacle but with quiet assurance. It ends where it began, with ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary faithfulness. There is no grand farewell speech, no moment of triumph claimed by its characters. Instead, Scripture leaves us with the image of a child in Naomi's arms, a restored lineage, and a future unfolding beyond the horizon of the story itself. In this restraint, the Book of Ruth offers one of its most profound truths. God's faithfulness often completes its work quietly, without announcing itself. Ruth's life does not follow the arc of ambition or conquest. It follows the arc of loyalty. She is remembered not for power, wealth, or public authority, but for staying when leaving would have been safer, for working when despair would have been understandable, and for trusting when outcomes were hidden. Her story reminds us that faithfulness is not always dramatic, but it is never insignificant. By the end of the narrative, Ruth stands fully included within the people of Israel, not by force, nor by erasure of her past, but by faithfulness lived out over time. She remains a Moabite woman, yet she is also a beloved wife, a mother, and an ancestor within Israel's royal line. Scripture does not flatten her identity, it redeems it. In Ruth, we see that God's covenant faithfulness does not require sameness, it honors devotion wherever it is found. Naomi's journey, too, reaches a place of rest. She does not recover what she lost, but she recovers hope. The bitterness that once defined her gives way to renewed purpose. She becomes a caretaker of future promise, holding in her arms the evidence that her story was never finished. Naomi's life teaches that God's faithfulness does not always restore what was taken, but it does restore meaning, belonging, and the capacity to hope again. The final genealogy lifts the story beyond its intimate setting and anchors it within God's larger redemptive plan. The loyalty of a foreign widow becomes part of the lineage of King David. What began with famine and displacement becomes foundational to Israel's future. This revelation invites a humbling realization: faithfulness practiced without awareness of legacy may still shape history in ways never imagined. Yet the Book of Ruth does not ask its readers to marvel at destiny. It asks them to consider devotion. Ruth does not act because she knows the outcome. She acts because love calls her to remain faithful in the present moment. Her life testifies that obedience does not require foresight, only trust. As this story closes, it offers an invitation rather than a conclusion. It invites us to examine where loyalty is being asked of us today. Where are we called to remain steady when circumstances are uncertain? Where might faithfulness look less like bold action and more like daily perseverance? Ruth's story suggests that God often works most powerfully through choices that feel small, unseen, or ordinary. It also gently challenges our understanding of success. Ruth's life was never about advancement or recognition. Yet her faithfulness placed her within God's unfolding purpose in ways no strategy could have achieved. This invites us to reconsider what it means to live well before God, not by striving for visibility, but by practicing love, integrity, and trust where we are. For those walking through loss, Ruth's story offers quiet hope. It does not promise immediate relief or easy answers. It promises presence, provision, and the possibility that God is at work even when His hand feels hidden. It reassures us that grief does not disqualify faith, and that waiting does not mean abandonment. For communities of faith, Ruth's life offers a model of welcome shaped by character rather than origin. It calls believers to recognize faithfulness wherever it appears, to protect the vulnerable, and to participate actively in God's redemptive work through kindness and responsibility. As you carry this story forward, let it linger gently. Let it reshape how you view ordinary days, uncelebrated work, and quiet devotion. Let it remind you that God's faithfulness often unfolds through love, practiced patiently, choice by choice, step by step. If the life of Ruth has spoken to you, consider returning to Scripture with fresh attentiveness, not searching only for dramatic moments, but for the steady rhythms of faithfulness that reveal God's heart. The Book of Ruth assures us that God is deeply present in those rhythms, weaving redemption through lives that choose love even when the path ahead is unclear. Thank you for journeying through the life of Ruth, loyalty and God's faithfulness with Divine Word Archives. May Ruth's quiet courage inspire your own, and may her story remind you that no act of faithfulness is ever wasted in the hands of a faithful God.